May they be so connected at a deepest soul level that the world would then know that you sent me. And I think if that were happening, we would do what Jesus does. We would think what he thinks, and we would look like what he really looks like in the world right now. And I don't think we're looking like him, because I don't think we're deeply abiding in him.
Welcome to my Boulevard. All right, we are here with my brother from another mother, Jeff Vanderstelt. This is a man that has had so much influence and so much impact in my life and in my ministry over these last, decade or plus, ever since the Verge years is when I first connected with you, with Michael Stewart, and all of those times and those years. And, and since then, there's been many times of us doing things together and trying to make things work and all of that. But you have always been someone that I've just admired and have learned so much from in so many different ways. So I'm glad to have you on and just to share some of that.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I've learned a lot from you too, Dhati. You've just been a real gift in the way that you have worked hard to put these things into practice, especially in the urban context. And so I'm just really grateful for you.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. And speaking of that, I often get impacted by people in different things. And the very first kind of impact that you had in my life is when I heard a talk that you gave. It was like a TED talk before I even knew what a TED talk was. But you gave a TED talk on 6 missional rhythms. And ever since that time, I was just locked in, because it's like one of those times where it's like he put to words what I've been feeling as someone who has not been I wasn't raised in the church. I wasn't I just didn't have any church background or church history or like that. And I just literally, when I first came to know the Lord, I was like, who's Samson and who's Delilah? I didn't have this type of context. And so, and I was just like, how do I become a Christian just in everyday life, and then just tried to live it. And so for the first few years I came to know the Lord in college, we just did that. We were just trying to do it. And it seems like you have a lot more flexibility in youth ministry to do and try a whole bunch of things. But it seems like when you kind of graduate to church, it's all right, you're supposed to do Sundays, Wednesdays. And it become very formulaic. And it was just we could actually take the gospel in everyday life. And I remember hearing that, and you put words to me. And so we talked about you talk about these 6 missional rhythms. And so you have written many other things. You have impacted me in many other ways. Even I was just showing, I have your latest book right now. We were just at Exponential and have your latest book. And now you're talking about a return to disciple making. You talk about shifts, some significant shifts in disciple making that we need to consider. And so I just want to let everybody know that there's other things that he does, but but every time I want to talk to him, I do want to come back to the missional rhythms. And so can you just talk a little bit about just kind of the origin story of that, and just kind of how that has shaped your ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is going way back to 2003, 2004, when we started our first church, Soma Church in Tacoma, and that's now a family of churches. One of my friends, we no longer are working together, but wonderfully gifted communicator and thinker. His name is Caesar. We together were wrestling through right around 2004, 2005. How do we help people move from this idea that they think missional is additional to seeing it as intentional? And that was because people kept thinking, I don't have time to be missional. And they were already thinking of all the things the church was asking them to do. And now they got to add more onto that. And they already got busy lives. And we just kept saying, no. The whole idea of the mission of God was not that you were supposed to add on a whole new thing. It's that you were supposed to live your life with gospel and missional intentionality, that you just do your life differently than the world does. And so we wrestle with what are those rhythms of life that are in the life of every single person that they're just going to do them no matter what, but they may not do them in great ways, but they're going to do them. And so we listed as many as we could come up with. And then we tried to simplify them down to 6, so that we felt like we had 20 or more. And we're that's just too much. So no one's going to remember that. And these were the 6 that we thought this carries the essence of humanity and the essence of missional living. And the ones that we landed with were, well, like we eat meals. Like everybody eats. Some people eat 2 meals a day. Some people eat 5 meals a day, depending on what kind of diet you have.
Mhm.
But everyone eats a few meals a day, and therefore many in a week. And so, what if you were to intentionally engage in your meals? So you weren't just eating alone, but you're eating with people. You're engaging in some of the other rhythms I'm about to describe around meals. And so that's not adding anything to your life. It's just adding intentionality to something you're already doing. So you eat meals together. While you're eating meals, you're always listening. Like that's another rhythm. We're always listening. Now, sometimes we're just listening to the stuff that's going on inside of our head. We're not really present with people, or we're not listening to the Holy Spirit. And so, but what if we were to be intentional that when we're eating a meal, we're truly present, we're truly listening to God, we're listening to people we're with, and that itself becomes a rhythm, that we become a present people who engage in listening. Francis Schaeffer once said, if I had 55 minutes with a person or an hour with a person, I would spend the first 55 minutes just asking really good questions and listening. So in the last 5 minutes, I might have some idea of what they might need to hear. And I think that's
Mm.
just a really good practice, that we're slow to speak, but quick to listen. So we just said, let's eat meals together. Let's listen well around the meals. And then we do stories. So we're a story form people. So when we're at the meal, we're listening to the person's story. We're trying to discern what's shaped them, what's formed them, what's created their worldview. And of course, we also, when we would develop disciples, we'd say, you're always going to live your life under the dominant narrative or story that you believe. That's how we all live our life. And so let's make sure we know the story, or we call it the story of God. So we formed every disciple in the story of God. So when they're listening to people, the backdrop is always the story of God. Does this person's story line up with what is true of God in the world? And how can we help them realize there's a better story that they're a part of? And so we'd be a story formed people. So we eat, we listen, we're story formed, listening for the story in light of the big story. And then while we're doing that, we want to be a people who believe we're blessed to be a blessing. So we're prepared as we listen to their story to say, what would sound like good news to them, or what would look like good news to them. So we're ready to give of our life, give of our resources, give of our time to people when we become more and more aware of their needs and their story. And some people might say, well, that does feel like it's not additional, or it doesn't feel like it's intentional. That feels additional. And I would just say, no, you're always blessing. The problem is
Mm.
most of us are just blessing ourselves.
Yeah.
And this is us changing it to say, no, we were made to be a people who receive and then give. That was how you were designed by God. So we bless in light of their story as we're listening around meals. And then over time, we learn how to celebrate in very kingdom like ways, whether that's having parties that are redemptive, celebrating every birthday, every anniversary, every holiday, but doing it with a gospel centered intentionality to do the things I just described. And I give you a
Yeah.
bunch of stories of how we help
Mhm.
people engage the party to be a display of the kingdom of God. And of course, that's all throughout the Bible. The picture of the kingdom is almost always around a party. Whether it's the feast that they were called to celebrate as Israel, or Jesus, the wedding feast in Cana, or him talking about this future wedding feast of the bride and the bridegroom. And then lastly, we just said, and in these rhythms, make sure you recreate, which is make
Mm.
sure you're resting, have a rhythm of rest. That's Sabbath. That was built into the very fabric of creation. And then creating, that's working or beautifying or making things that weren't already, bringing new things into existence. That you do that anyway. That's called work, but do it in a rhythm of rest and play, rest and create, rest and work. And so
Yeah.
those are the 6 rhythms that we've just laid out: eat meals, listen, story, bless as you get to know their story, celebrate around the rhythms of celebration with kingdom approach to it, and then make sure you have a rhythm of resting, creating, resting and working, resting and playing. So yeah.
So what I love about those is that that is not specific to any type of church. You have pastored the Soma church, you have house churches, and like
Yeah.
you pastored micro churches, you pastored mega churches. And so I mean, for somebody that has a variety of different types of churches, I mean, is there one church model that's better suited to kind of house these missional rhythms?
Well, there would I would only say that if the church doesn't give people time to live life, then that's a bad model.
Yeah,
Right, if they're
that's good.
constantly calling them to the programs and events of the church, so they can't even
That's
eat
good.
meals with people, they can't even like, none of this life is possible, that would be the only bad model, but any model that allows people to be in everyday life and have it count is a good model,
Yeah.
and I would say, like, I would confront some things, like, I hear pastors often say, like, like, these parents that have their kids in kids' sports, they're like, it's their idol, and they just need to quit sports, I'm like, "No, no, that's wrong thinking." Teach them how
Mm,
to engage in the sports as a missional place, and
mm,
then teach them to engage these rhythms as missionary people. I mean, all the rest of those people in the sports, they probably don't know Jesus. So like, don't pull
that's
them out
good.
of it. That's the mission field. So if you
Mhm.
have a model that increasingly pulls people out of the world for your thing, then that would be a bad model. But if you see your model as we're equipping people for everyday life and we're helping them to live whatever they do in everyday life with gospel and missional intentionality, then lots of models can work on that.
Yes, that's really good. And what I love about you is that you don't just communicate these rhythms in a succinct and clear and compelling way, but you also are a practitioner. These are things that you have lived in all of throughout all this time. What has been some of kind of the joys and the challenges of actually living these out?
Well, I mean, the joys are a lot of our friends are people who were non Christians and then they became Christians just simply through everyday life. The joy of getting to now, my kids are older now, but when they were in youth sports, I love sports and I love being a missionary, and I got to be a missionary in the normal stuff that my kids were involved in, which meant that I was always with people who don't know Jesus. Like, it was just
Mhm,
normal, and I love that. I mean,
mhm.
I love being with people who don't know Jesus. I love leading them to Jesus. So the joys are I've got to see so many people come to faith. I've gotten to see so much of life be normalized and yet intentionalized, and therefore I've seen God's work break in so many unique and beautiful spaces that a lot of times people think God won't break into. And I could give you
Mm,
so many stories about that. Now, the sorrows, the pains are, when you do this kind of life intentionally with people, you also enter into their pain and you enter
mm,
into rejection. There's going to be times it doesn't go well. You're going to have people that you love dearly, and then, you know, they don't stay your friends always. Like, there's loss and there's
yeah,
difficulty and there's pain and there's sacrifice, and so that's real. I would never want to paint the
yeah,
picture that this is just super easy and it's always fun. Like, sometimes
yeah,
it's really painful, and so but I would never trade it, because
yeah.
I'm way more alive when I'm living like this than when I'm living like in a Christian cul-de-sac and just hiding out from the world.
Yeah. A couple of things come from that to mind is like one, Andy Stanley used to always say that vision leaks, right? How often do you have to repeat these rhythms to the congregation, especially with the turnover and how much of it is caught and taught, and how intentionally are you in terms of kind of embodying and keeping this culture before you?
Well, you said, I've actually led in a variety of contexts, so it's been different in each context, but I'll give you a couple examples of how we did it. When we were leading in Tacoma, Washington, every fall we did a series on identity and rhythms. So
Mhm.
we aren't talking about the identities, but you can read more about that in
Yep.
the book. Saturate actually captures both of these.
Okay.
Um, but then, so we would do 3 or 4 weeks on the identities, and then we would do usually 3 to 6 weeks, depending how it worked on the rhythm. Sometimes we would just do two rhythms each week, but we taught through it every single fall for, I bet we did that for 12 years in a row. Just kept doing it over and over and over again. And people would get to the fall and they're like, we know what you're going to do. I'm like, good. You can help teach it then. It's like, that's the goal. We don't want we want it to be familiar. We don't always want to have a new teaching that, wow, this is fresh and new. It's like, no, some of it needs to be repeat. And so we
Mhm.
did that. In some cases, we made it like a part of our new member process. So, like the last church I led, that was our membership process. In order to become a member, you went through the teaching on all these things. and you made an agreement to live these ways. And that was actually a way of like when you became a member, you were committing to live out your new identity in Christ in these everyday rhythms with a group of people. And that was actually like the membership covenant that you were agreeing to. So that's how we did it then. I think in almost every situation I've been in, I think if I can remember correctly, we probably did sometime around at least once a year, once every 18 months, we would reteach everything. So
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
consistently.
Pretty consistent. That's good. I mean, because that's what it's, culture building and creating culture and keeping that in front, I think is an important thing. All right. So part of this,
By
a
the way,
lot of
it was also like in our artifacts. So like throughout our buildings, we'd have the rhythms on the wall, or we would have slides that were rotate, or we'd have stories that were being told on Sundays around these things on a regular basis. So we were reiterating them in a whole other bunch of forms as well. So
Yeah, and it's the idea of living everyday life with gospel intentionality is something that you've often stated is like in being able to create that. In another way that we've talked about, we're doing a conference this year called Live Local, right? And just the idea
hmm,
of trying to get people to take responsibility of where they live, where they work, and where they worship, right? Because if we can take responsibility of where we live, work, and worship individually, I think we will make it impact globally as the body of Christ, right? And I think
that's right.
oftentimes we kind of want to skip that step and we want to just jump to the social media, jump to the thing, in which there's a time and a place for all of that in digital and all, but it just seems like we have lost the art of just being present, in our
We really
communities,
have.
so I
Yeah.
want to play a game with you. All right. And this is kind of the
Okay.
first thing that kind of comes to your mind. And I want you to give like, like, look, it's like, think about speed dating. All right. Like
Okay. Okay.
and so I'm going to ask you this, and it's centered around kind of Christians right now. Like if you were to think about evangelicals, Christians, us living locally of where we live, where we work, where we worship, our play, if we were to think about kind of what you've embodied in these six missional rhythms, I want you to ask, and I'm going to give you the four early, but then I'm going to ask you in quick, precise order. I'm going to ask you basically when it comes to that currently and what what's working, what's broken, what's missing, and what's confusing. All right. So that's what I'm going to ask you on each one of those. So I'm giving you like the cheat sheet, and now we're going to go through. But think about it
So
like
what is it? What's
no, no,
working?
you can't write it down. You
Okay.
can't write it down. This is this. Think about like the Family Feud. At the very
Okay.
end in the Family Feud, they give you just the short, like so short pithy answers just off the top, and this is what we're gonna do. All right.
Okay.
All right. So again, when it comes to like missional rhythms and what you started 20 years ago and just helping people to live missionally, right? And now if you think about just you talk a lot to people, you speak in a lot of things, and so you have a lot of exposure to things, right? All right. So in light of the current state of evangelicalism, when it comes to living out these six missional rhythms, what's working?
What is working is people are re-embracing the table. I would say
Releasing
that's
the
one thing I see is working is people are re-embracing the need for table fellowship is working.
Okay. What's
I mean, I could
broken?
add more to it. I don't know if you want me to add more, but that's
No,
the
no,
short
no.
answer,
What's
right? That's what you're
broken?
looking
Yeah,
for.
that's
Yeah.
it. That's great. What's broken?
I don't think in light of those rhythms, I don't think we're listening well to people.
Hmm.
I think we are speaking past each other. We don't know how to listen and be present with one another.
Okay. What's missing?
What is missing is, I think, story. I don't know that we know how to do story well. I don't know if we know how to know the story well. And I don't know, like, I feel like the story is missing in a lot of these conversations. We just don't take the time to know somebody well enough to know their story.
That's good. That's good. What's confusing?
Hmm. I think what is confusing is our message. I
Hmm.
don't think people know what we believe anymore because we're so loud about everything but Jesus and the gospel and the kingdom, and I think we've lost the heart of the message. So it's super confusing. People don't even know what we believe because they think it's politics or something else, but I don't think they know our message anymore.
That's good. That was easy. That was good.
Yeah, there you
And,
go.
and it's always good because it's like to see people who are professional communicators to to think on the spot, to think quickly and concisely. It's always fun.
Those are
It's
good
always
questions
fun.
though, man. Love it. Yeah.
That's good. All right. So a couple more questions before we kind of wrap. But is when we think and kind of staying in that theme of just living missionally locally, right? And I kind of alluded to it, but we're in a digital age, right? You know, and they talk about Gen Z. I mean, they live on their phones. We now live on our phones. Like it's a very digital age. What does your rhythm speak to living in a digital age, or even like how would you speak to us living missionally locally in a digital age, and how is that shift or the impact that does it have on the message?
Yeah, I mean, well, my kids are all Gen Z, so like I watch it in front of me all the time, and what I see with them is their anxiety levels are at an all-time high because the digital age has created a sense that I'm never enough and I'm never doing enough and I never know enough. And so they actually need embodied practices to
Mhm.
help them embrace their limitations. And so there's probably in a lot of ways these rhythms aren't as natural, sadly, because a lot of they aren't eating well. Like let's just be honest, like a lot of them are not
Mhm.
slowing down to have good meals. They're not listening well. Their stories are all everything is sound bites, so you don't really get story. You just get like pieces of stories. Like if we were to just take those rhythms, and a lot of them are broken, and I'm not saying they're broken because we are where we ought to be. I think we've got to recognize that we've got a broken world now. And what's great is my kids still long for all this life. Like it
Mm.
hasn't changed. They still desire everything we just talked about, but they're
Yeah.
trying to live in two worlds. And so, what I think we need to do is we need to let social media speak about life as it ought to be, and then connect people to go do that life where they live, um, and and learn how to shut it off. I mean, it's not bad. It can serve it, but it can also cause us to avoid it and miss out on it altogether. So, like my daughter this last week went on a camping trip for 4 or 5 days. She's 22, and she said, "Dad, one of the greatest things was I just didn't have, I couldn't get reception for a
Mm.
lot of that time, and it was probably the most peaceful I've felt
Mm.
in years, because the anxiety level is so high when this is always on. And so that rhythm, even recreating, it's like, yeah, let's use it for good things. Let's build with it. Let's connect with it. Let's do all that. But let's also have a rhythm of recreating. Like, let's rest from it.
Mm.
Let's Sabbath from it. Like, I think you can use it well when you learn to not use it. That's how everything is. I can work
Yeah.
better when I also can go without work. I can eat better when I can also fast. Like all the things in life work better when I can actually fast or Sabbath from them. So I think that's going to be a real rhythm that's going to be needed in this digital age is the
Yeah.
resting from so we can engage more in more healthy ways in it.
So, how would you advise pastors and leaders and missionaries to equip the saints around them in this digital age to live local?
Make sure you're creating embodied spaces and give them in those embodied spaces something they can't get in a social media or digital form. So like I know all of us had to adjust during COVID, and we learned how to put, our sermons on video and everything else, and God's used that, so I'm not going to tear that down. But I hear a lot of pastors go like, no one wants to come back to church. And what they mean by that is the Sunday gathering. And I'm like, well, that's because they can get everything they got from the Sunday gathering now in a digital form. So why not then provide something on Sunday that you can't get in a digital form? Like, why not
Mm.
create a space that provides for them what everybody really wants? Digital form will provide everything else, but they
Mm.
can't provide embodied presence. It doesn't provide greeting one another with a hug. It doesn't provide truly bearing with one another's burdens as I lay my hand on you and pray for you and weep with you. Like those things are really hard to do in digital space. So I think the church needs to adjust and say, let digital space do what it does. Now, because that's already done for you, you can actually do other things. Whereas before, you had to get them to come to a Sunday, hear a sermon,
Mm,
like everything had to be done in an hour and 15 minutes. Now you could go like, hey, we got all the digital content they could ever dream of. Now, what if we made Sunday actually more embodied presence? So I think we're going to have to learn how
that's
to
right.
adjust in this new age, because they're going to get all the best teaching, all the best content from somebody else. And that's
Yeah.
not bad. It just means you've got to rethink what you do as a local church.
Is that like doing things like taking the sacraments, the Lord's table, like doing some of those things
Yes.
more? Some when you talk about embodied presence.
I think
Yeah.
that's why a lot of the next generation is attracted to more Anglican forms or Orthodox forms or even Catholic forms, because they're seeing physical presence in they're seeing something in the experience. It's not just a 30, 40-minute message. In fact,
Mm,
most of those churches have a very short message and lots of embodied practices. And so
mm.
you might need to rethink some of those practices, even taking time to confess to one another your need for Jesus and praying with each other. Like those are things you could do together in the gathered space, because you
Yeah.
don't need to do as much teaching. I'm not saying we shouldn't do teaching, but you can give them a message during the week. Hey, I want you to listen to this message on your phone. And then when we get together on Sunday, we're going to talk about it and we're going to practice it. Like you really could engage it in a way we've never gotten to engage it before. So
Yeah.
I think you could take it to a whole new level of experience.
That's good. That's a shift in thinking. That's a shift in thinking and a shift, and I think which is needed. I think too
Yeah,
many of us are trying to get back to pre-pandemic church, right? Or get back to where we were instead of, seeing this as a new normal. God has given us the ability to re-engage in some creative ways. And so,
that's right.
so
And
yeah,
Dhati,
so
I would just add to that, like just one last thing on that. It's not altogether new, because the early church was given a letter, like
Mhm.
Romans, that was delivered by Phoebe. They were given this letter, they read it, and then they spent probably weeks or months or even years talking about it and practicing it and working it out. It's like, what if we could give the church a letter in the form of a digital message? Hey, I'm going to give you a sermon this Monday. You got all week to listen to it. And then when we get together next Sunday, we're going to talk about it. We're going to devote ourselves to it. We're going to practice it so that you're actually learning to do the things I'm teaching you when we come together. So
Yeah,
I
no,
think there's
that's
some new
real.
ways to think about this, man.
I love it.
So,
I love it. We're gonna have to get together and just work through some of those. You can download all the things you're thinking because I'll be your test case. We gotta figure it out. So
yes.
speaking of shifts, you've just recently wrote a book, about the shift in disciple makings. And again, in here, I think it's 6. So I don't know if this is some infatuation about the number 6. But no, it's actually 5. So we
It's
got
five.
less.
It's five.
We got
Yes.
less in this one. So you're getting more either precise or you just lazy. I don't know which one it is, but like we went from 6 to 5 here. But what was kind of the motivation, inspiration from about this book?
Yeah, so Dave Ferguson from Exponential asked if I would speak into the direction of Exponential 24. It just happened about a month ago, the conference, and so I began to speak into it. He had picked 5. He said, "I want you to come up with 5 shifts." He had kind of given me a framework already ahead of time, and I said,
Okay.
"How much do I get to speak into this?" He says, "As much as you want." And so we pretty much rewrote almost all of what was originally in the first outline. And then he said, would you turn that into a book? And so that's the book, 180, A Return to Disciple Making. And those 5 shifts were just what we recognized most church leaders are going to have to shift toward if they want to get back to disciple making as the main mission of the church. So, yeah, I don't know if you want me to tell you what they are real quick
Yeah,
or.
I'll just read it and instead of, because I want them to go buy the book. So I'll just read the shifts and you can say which one is most, you can just kind of go on whatever one you would want to go. So in here, the shifts are from reaching to making. Shift number 2 is from informing to equipping. Shift number 3 is from attending to attaching. Shift number 4 is from striving to thriving, and then the last one is from accumulating to deploying. So you choose one of them and just say why one of them is, you think it's important for us to kind of go read the book if it's just for this one. Go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the one for me that's most present is from attending to attaching. Um, and the idea that we're not calling people to attend a group or attend a Sunday or just attend our events. We really want them to experience attachment love to God the Father, attachment with their true self, because we can't be sanctified if we aren't integrated, if we aren't whole internally, and then attached to real people in deep, deep loving relationships. And I think a lot of people are going through life very detached. They are not, they do all the spiritual disciplines, but they aren't deeply abiding in Christ, or they do spiritual behaviors and practices, but they don't know how to be present with themselves and truly loving one another as they love themselves. And so I think it may be one of the biggest needs of the day is to really embrace an attachment based disciple making that does a holistic approach to formation instead of just primarily giving people a bunch of activities and a bunch of information. We want them to learn how to abide in Christ. And like Jesus prayed in John 17, Father, as I am in you and you are in me, may they be in us and may they be one, which is another way of saying, may they also be in each other. May they be so connected at a deepest soul level that the world would then know that you sent me. And I think if that were happening, we would do what Jesus does. We would think what he thinks, and we would look like what he really looks like in the world right now. And I don't think we're looking like him because I don't think we're deeply abiding in him.
Man, for that alone, go get this book. It is 180, A Return to Disciple Making. That is worth the wait, just what you just said, man. Thank you so much,
Mhm.
Jeff. It is always a blessing. It's always a pleasure. I'm always like inspired, challenged, ready to come to Seattle and spend some time with you every time we talk. So I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much,
So,
Dhati.
all right, and that is it. This is my Boulevard. Until next time, grace and peace.